This is one of the first ones on leadership we want to talk about. And we were just saying about how do we talk about leadership and why leadership? I mean, why do we get involved in leadership?
So I guess, as clinicians, as physicians, as GPs, it is very much the bread and butter of our day-to-day work. Whether it's managing patients in terms of taking them through management journeys or through management plans, whether it's working with our nursing colleagues, our practice colleagues to try and understand, what is it, how can we go through and address certain problems. But then also from a sort of wider level, actually, part of the reason why a lot of us get involved in primary care and family medicine and general practice is because we are attracted to a number of different things. So it's not just one clinical area, it's not a single disease, but also when it comes to managing systems, I think this is an area that most family physicians have some understanding of. They may not be comfortable in that area, but it's something that they are aware of, and they know that there are many different determinants of the disease. So someone that comes to you with blood pressure problems, it's not just a simple matter of the fact that, they're slightly overweight, or the fact that they've got too much salt intake. There's lots of different things that are impacting that. And obviously you can give them tablets, you can give them lifestyle advice, but there's other things that one needs to do to try and address that problem. And then from a system level, actually, there's certain things like, why is it that we are not paying providers to do some of these things? Or why is it that we are paying providers to do some other things? Why is it that we're not doing, all these sorts of questions? I think they require you to have some competence, some ability to be able to make change happen. And essentially what leadership, there's many different definitions of what leadership is, but the way I like to think of it is it's a competence. So it's not something that you kind of go and run a course and you say, that's it, I've got leadership, in the same way that you could learn how to suture, or you could learn how to, manage hypertension. It's a bit like building a muscle. You have to continuously work at it, and it has to be a purposeful way through which you do that. And you have to practice it, and you have to practice it in a context that is not just in the gym, in a sort of controlled environment. It has to be in the real world, where you're picking up heavy objects, when you're in a fight with someone, or when you're in all these different scenarios. You need to be able to understand how to use that competence, how to use that skill. And essentially what that skill is, it's to be able to take an idea, to take a concept, and to make it happen. Often that's not something that's done alone, and it's often done against a particular gradient. So whether that's, against people who don't believe in your idea, or it's against people who don't want to fund your idea, or it's against people who, are mocking and ridiculing you for having these ideas. There's probably a more, succinct, shorter textbook definition, but that's the kind of way I like.
Yeah, I mean, and that sort of very nicely brings me to the sort of the line of thinking that I've been thinking, because what I've often seen or maybe experienced, or maybe this is just one aspect of leadership, is that leadership almost sounds political when you are in sort of, when you want something in healthcare, for example, and you want to change the way things are done. It's almost, government versus governments, or political party versus political parties, and their agenda of healthcare should be. I mean, one example can be the differences of general practice between England and Wales, different governments. And same as thing like when I'm looking at places like Pakistan, leadership the role is predominantly from student life, is being involved in the political movement or in a student union, which has got a little bit of a political flair to it. So, I mean, how does one actually protect themselves from that? Or is that good or bad? I don't know. What are your experiences? Have you sort of felt any political pull or political influences on leadership?
Of course, but I guess I've got to go back and perhaps challenge the presumption that leadership is political. I mean, as we talked about, what is leadership? Anyone in a family, a husband or a wife, they are a leader for their family. Anyone who has any form of responsibility for another person, whether that's a caring responsibility, whether that is a teacher, for example, for the students, they have that same burden that is placed upon them to do things. And you wouldn't be wrong to say that, politics influences that, politics with a sort of capital P, if you like, the way that the government and political parties work. And a lot of people would say that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. So if you're not able to influence, and if you're not able to be part of those conversations as to how, in our case, the health system or our patients are being handled, you are basically subject to the whims and the desires of whatever it is that they decide. So how do you manage that? I mean, obviously, if you are of a political view, if you're part of a particular political party, then I suppose that's easier for you because you can just kind of go with that political ideology. But if you haven't got that, sort of capital P, then you need to develop those political competence as well. So you need to understand what is in this, what's called window, for instance. If there are, for example, public health at the moment is something that's very topical because of the coronavirus. You would, if you were a leader in any sort of situation, very much be looking to capitalize on the fact that the media, the politicians, the celebrities, the common people are interested in how can we better serve public health to tackle the coronavirus. So you have to be a bit politically turned on to know what exactly is going on. And how do you sort of, as you said, in some contexts, people assume or people think that leadership is a sort of student thing. And of course, you see the sharp end of it a lot more when you're a student and you're on campus and you're seeing people, whether it's protesting or petitions or being much more involved in the student union and then that side of life. But as you enter into the professional work, perhaps people have access to or people are necessarily comfortable with, because when you move away from the fairly, I suppose, the insular and quite well protected and quite well ring-fenced world of university and medical school, you enter into this big bad world of being employed and getting money, and then obviously you've got other commitments that come with that, whether it's your family or mortgage and other things, and then suddenly everyone starts to get a bit grown up and decides not to rock the boat because there's a career progression that you have to sort of go ahead with. And I think that's partly where some of the apathy also sets in, where people are like, well, I don't want to rock the boat because I'm 1 or 2 years away from getting this fellowship, or I've almost finished my training, or I've just got this excellent, posting in this place, and I really want to settle and mess things around. We let that very valid and legitimate concerns, we let them sort of become the compass through which we navigate these problems. The other side of it is also the sort of feeling of imposter syndrome, which all of us feel all the time, where you feel like, why should I, or how can I, as someone who is so junior, or someone who doesn't know all this stuff, or someone who is, et cetera, not part of the old boys, all these sorts of things. How can I do anything here? And that is something that all leaders, and even if you don't see yourself as a leader, all people experience that. Every new parent will feel like they're an imposter. How can I look after this child? Every new grandparent will say, how can I be a good grandparent? And every time, the first time someone, has any sort of responsibility, this is inevitable that happens. So there's many different reasons as to why I think that necessarily translate from the sort of university experience into the real world. And certainly if your university experience is very heavily politicized, so if you're on a campus where the only exposure that you have to change is political change with a capital P, then it's understandable that when you enter into the workplace, you will disengage from that altogether because you see it as a party political thing. Whereas in essence, if you're, and this comes on to another point about values and what is it that you stand for. So if you're someone that stands for justice and equality and wanting the best for your patients, it doesn't matter what political party is in charge. You would be looking to work with those parties, or even ignoring them whereas you can, to work within the system to actually bring about the aims and the outcomes that you want for your patients. So quite a sort of multi-layered answer to your question.
Yes, it's
I hope I've addressed it.
You have absolutely, and it sort of takes me on to the next point, really, because leadership we need to do in essence where you're working in a government organization, for a health board, for a trust, for a health department, etc. And then there's also something that you see a gap, a niche in something that you feel should happen, and it perhaps isn't there. So that sort of brings me on to creating organizations or institutions which are non-governmental. So, for example, you've been the secretary of British Islamic Muslim Association, the BIMA, for a few years now, and it's sort of I believe it's a charity organization working on mostly Muslim academics, producing papers and issues related. I mean, I'm sure you'll tell us more about that, but we've got that sort of a image of a charity being run. What are the problems that one would feel in starting something like that? Because you're absolutely not working with a preset group. You have to make people come together and motivate ideas, and be all on the same page for something to actually start moving forward. So what do you think about that?
So I guess it goes back to the last point I was making about your values. So who are you, and what is it that you're trying to do? So the British Islamic Medical Association, BIMA, is as you mentioned, is trying to address this gap where you have very good and strong institutions in the British healthcare and British civic society, which cater for many different hats that people wear. So, for example, we have a very strong representation within the healthcare system. So whether it's a department that deals with education, so health education, England, for example, for those who are in England, the health boards in Wales, for instance, that deal with the commissioning side of things. You've got Public Health England, Public Health Wales that deal with the public health side of things. So there is that sort of maturity there. When it comes to the workforce, we're reasonably well furnished, again, by having unions. So we've got the British Medical Association, which is the main trade union. We've got a newer one that's formed, which is Doctors Association UK, which is more like a campaigning organization. You then have, specialty organizations like the Royal Colleges. You then have other groups that are more to do with contractual issues like the local medical committees. So this is very much to a UK context that you can, as a GP, as a medic, you're quite well furnished as a profession. But when it comes to someone that's got a different background or different interests, those organizations will have within them abilities to articulate and to campaign, lobby, and be there for you. But they may not necessarily have that authentic representation of those communities. So this is the gap that you mentioned. So what a few of us got together and did is that we realized that there wasn't that representative gap. There was a representative gap, excuse me, and we wanted to fill that. But the way that we go ahead and make that gap become filled is we need to articulate what that is and who are we, what are we trying to do, and why is it that what we are trying to do is something that cannot be filled by something that already exists. Because there's a phrase, that chicken shop mentality, that you see someone who's got a success enterprise on the road, and you're like, well, do you know what, I want to copy that, and I'm going to put my shop right next door to them. And you see a lot of that taking place within the sort of civic sector, and arguably even in the healthcare sector. You see a successful clinic on one end of the street, and then there's another clinic on the other end of the street. What we need to do is articulate what is our why, who are we, what are we trying to do, what is our vision, what are our values. And so the British Islamic Medical Association was essentially trying to unite, inspire, and serve Muslim healthcare professionals in the United Kingdom to serve the professions and their patients. So that is, something that we do, and is very much imbibed in all of our activities, and is the mainstay by which we have attracted people into this void that we identified. So you go and you'd speak to individuals and say that, listen, there is this gap. This is what we're trying to do. What do you think? And then slowly over the years, we were established in 2013, nearly 7.5 years later, You know, we have got over 1,000 members that are slowly being attracted to this vision, and the projects that we've done have been an extension of that. So, for example, delivering health promotion activities in the mosque setting. So the exact same activities that you would get in a outside of a place of worship setting. So cancer screening, for instance, that you would typically get in a hospital clinic or in a school or you know, anywhere else. We deliver that exact same message, but in the place of worship, recognizing that the outcomes that we want to change is amongst this hard to reach community of, in the UK context, this Black, Asian and minority ethnic community who don't always understand the messages that come from government when it comes to the language, when it comes to the way you're changing people's behavior. If that same message is given by someone that looks like them, talks like them, and can translate it into a way that activates their behavior. So in our context, that's by using religious messaging to encourage people to take care of their health. We're actually able to do better than the quote unquote government offer, but it's the same thing that we're doing. So those sorts of things that, you know, we've been able to do, and it's been recognized by the government, by public health bodies, that this is something that they value, and it's not something that they would be able to do, and arguably perhaps they shouldn't give it the final mile. But you could then, one of the things that we're trying to do is actually make sure that this work that we're doing, because it's completely voluntary, as you said, you know, we're not a charity, but we're a non-profit.
No.
So none of our activities, I'm not paid for it. None of our volunteers are paid for it. None of the 3,000 people that are signed up are paid for it. And if anything, they pay to be part of that, of this project. And such is people's strength and motivation that they're willing to give up their time and the money to address this cause, which again emphasizes the point of having a strong value proposition, because otherwise you won't draw people into that. But what we're trying to do is to demonstrate to policymakers and to the government to say that actually, look, you've got volunteers that are able to do this work, take the existing piece, you know, government messaging, and actually have better outcomes with it. Perhaps this is something that you should fund. Again, not necessarily us to do, and a certain portion of it that they could do. And that's the sort of next stage of our work. And it's important that, you know, when you do have these gaps that you identify, is that, and this may be different for different contexts, but certainly in the UK context, we're not trying to replace the state. What we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage and lobby and engineer sort of a scenario where existing work is augmented by the approach that we're taking. So we definitely don't want to create an alternative health service or anything like that. But what we want to do is bring in this perspective into it.
Thank you very much. I think one of the last two things that I wanted to ask was training for leadership. And the second thing, which is sort of related to that, is called motivation. Now, personally, on a personal level, you know, there might be somebody who's really interested in leadership, or they want to change something, whether within their workplace setting or working as in a voluntary capacity. They might want to get some training, and that's where the training courses comes in. I think there's a Mary Stokes training program. There is the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management, and this is in the UK context. There are some other leadership courses, pockets, sort of here and there. How do you learn leadership? What do you go through in leadership courses? And does that help you in motivating people in how you can understand or read people in order to get the best out of them and try to motivate them in doing certain goals?
Yes, but again, I would say that the best way to learn is to practice and put yourself in that. And often on these leadership courses, which there are many, they often have a prerequisite that is that you need to have some degree of leadership role or leadership interest by which you can practice what you're being taught. Because otherwise, one, it's not reinforced, and secondly, it just remains theory, and theory without action isn't really much use for you. You can have learned the entire textbook as to how to manage difficult people, but until you've actually spoken to a difficult person, you won't really know which theory to pull out and when. So yes, to answer the question, there is the Faculty of Leadership of Medical Management in the UK, which has a fellowship program, which is something that I did a few years ago, which is a 1-year sort of immersive experience. There are also within the faculty other voluntary roles that one can take in terms of being part of committees and writing reports and those sorts of things. That's more of a formalized leadership role. The Royal Colleges, many of the Royal Colleges in the UK have a sort of fellowship program. So the Royal College of Physicians has a program called the Chief Registrar Program. And there's online courses such as the NHS Leadership Academy. They've got the Edward Jenner program. There's a Ready Now program. There's many different sort of online things, purely from a leadership point of view. But then there's other aspects of work within a clinical setting which involve leadership, such as quality improvement. So the Institute of the IHI, the Institute of Health Improvement in America, they have free to access to anyone across the world to do a number of modules in which they learn how to change, monitor and present improvements in healthcare. So whether you are a single, if you're the only trainee, let's say, in a rural context, in a rural practice, and you want to improve the antibiotic prescribing, you can take that quality improvement methodology and even as a junior, start work on that in your context and see what small changes that you can make, even within your ability. So you as an individual prescriber can see if you change to something else, what outcomes does that have? And then that's, another way that a lot of people can start their journey. Another way is to start writing. So a lot of people like blogs or, even nowadays on Twitter, people are quite good at sort of summarizing events that are going on and being part of the conversation and giving their perspectives as representatives in that field, again, as a student or as a trainee or as someone from a specialty that isn't perhaps well represented. Just put your thoughts out there and see how people respond to that. Then, there's work that you can do in a voluntary capacity. So again, whether that's an organization like BIMA or, from the BMA, for instance, they've got lots of positions that come up. Again, Royal Colleges will have faculty posts and positions that they advertise for. So in those posts, so, you don't have to necessarily have that post, but getting into that post and getting into a position where you're able to say, right, I want to do something different. So again, this could just be a junior doctor on a ward round saying that I think the way that we have this pro forma for clerking our patients could be a little bit simpler. You can easily make that change and see what happens there. Often the more junior you are, you feel like you need to have, often the permission isn't necessary because a lot of people are just too busy to deal with these sorts of things. And they would welcome someone who comes in with a proposal to say, listen, chief medical officer or clinical director, this form that we were using to clerk the patients was taking us twice as long as this new one that I've designed. No one would say no to the new one that you've designed if you've gone the whole distance and shown that. But what you may find difficult to do, if you're sitting there waiting for permission for people to tell you that it's okay for you to do that, you may be waiting a long time. So there is a degree of just not necessarily waiting for permission, but at the same time not being reckless and foolhardy and throwing the baby out the bathwater, as it were, and recognizing that you need to work with the system, rock the boat, don't turn the boat upside down. So there are loads of opportunities, as I said, formal and informal, and the best way to learn is by doing it. I'm by no means an expert on this, but I've learned a few things in terms of how to deal with difficult, how to manage difficult people, how to manage quiet people, how to manage particularly loud people. A lot of it I have learned from practice, from having to be in that situation dozens of times, for me to draw back on those experiences. I have enormous help by reading things, by speaking to other people, by having mentoring, by having peer support and colleagues as well, who I can say that, listen, I've got this person that, they're great, but they're really, creating havoc in the team. How do I deal with them? That's the best way that, you can actually go ahead and do it. But really what you need to do is start your journey. Everyone's journey is different. For some people, it'll be the love of having absolutely no experience or any training and feeling completely out their depth. And for others, it will be at the very bottom of the chain as, you know, as a first year student trying to work their way up. Both of them have their challenges, both of them have their opportunities. But the important thing is that one takes advantage of the opportunities that comes to them and just continues practicing, because that's the only way one will learn.
Thank you very much, Salman. And I think you're right, because I think there is an interest of leadership in most people. You must have heard of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It reportedly sold more than 30 million copies, sort of in different languages. So there is sort of a thirst there where people want to learn how to manage certain scenarios and certain things. Thank you very much for coming on today. It's been quite insightful and useful to have some sort of a background on leadership. Hopefully we'll get you again sometime in the future to talk further about these things in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
Thank you.